Welcome to West Film. We bring you the best movie recaps, reviews, ending explained videos, and hidden details from your favorite films. If you love great movies, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Now grab some popcorn, and let's jump into today's movie. They make it absolutely clear to Ali that he's never supposed to leave the island again. As far as they're concerned, survival comes down to one simple rule: stay hidden today if you want to live tomorrow. Realizing that Ali still doesn't grasp how dangerous the world really is, his father decides it's finally time to tell him the truth about their history, even though Ali's mother insists he's still too young to hear it. Before his father can get very far, Ali's grandmother steps in and takes over the story herself. She tells Ali that long ago, the valley was a completely different place. Back then, every animal lived in fear under the shadow of a ruthless wolf that ruled the land. Help only arrived when mysterious, towering beings called the Zo entered the valley. These enormous, tree-like creatures had extraordinary abilities. They could transform animals in incredible ways and even grant different species the power to understand one another. For the first time, creatures that had once feared each other were able to live in peace. But the harmony didn't last. Furious at losing his grip over the valley, the wolf stole the Zo's power for himself. The transformation twisted him into something monstrous. The terrifying fire wolf. Consumed by rage and power, he destroyed many of the Zo and forced the survivors to flee the valley entirely. Ever since, the fire wolf has ruled through fear. Strangely enough, the story doesn't frighten Ali at all. If anything, he seems almost bored by it. We then learn Ali belongs to a small species called the Pacu. At the moment, the Pacu community is celebrating its annual piplet harvest, grateful for the food they've gathered. During the celebration, Ali spots a tiny Jovin nearby. True to form, his curiosity takes over, and he approaches the little creature, realizing it's struggling to crack open a piplet. Wanting to help, Ali shows it how to open the fruit, even taking a bite himself first to prove it's harmless. The young creature quickly picks up the trick and happily starts eating, even bringing back more piplets so the two of them can share. For a moment, the whole thing feels sweet and harmless. Then Ali's father appears. The instant he spots Ali next to the bird, panic sets in. Things get worse when the baby Jovin starts screeching for help. Without hesitation, Ali's father yanks him away and hides him from view. But the damage is already done. Now the baby Jovin returns with its whole flock, and after picking up Ali's trick for opening the fruit, the birds tear through the entire harvest in minutes. Everything the Pacu spent so long gathering vanishes almost instantly. Just like that, Ali accidentally causes one of the worst disasters his people have ever faced. Back in the present, Ali finally escapes the predators chasing him and returns home, only to find total chaos among the Pacu. Winter is closing in, and with their food supply destroyed, fear spreads through the community and many believe they won't survive the season. The guilt crushes Ali. He blames himself entirely for the disaster and regrets ever helping the Jovin in the first place. Then an old memory surfaces. He once saw a Jovin get spooked by reflected light. That gives him an idea. Ali gathers broken pieces of glass and uses sunlight reflections to scare the birds away from what's left of the crops. At first, it works perfectly. Other flashes of light send the Jovin retreating in fear. But the victory doesn't last. One particularly aggressive Jovin charges straight at him. Ali manages to blind it with another flash, but the bird crashes into him anyway, and the two go tumbling. The impact knocks Ali off balance, and he plunges deep into a massive pit. Inside the pit, Ali discovers something unbelievable: a glowing pot, identical to the mysterious objects his grandmother described in her stories. Startled by the strange light, he instinctively backs away, loses his footing, and falls even deeper into the hole. Hours later, as night settles over the valley, Ali's family searches for him. Hearing their voices nearby, he calls out from inside the pit. But the moment he finally climbs out, everyone freezes in terror before scattering in panic. Confused, Ali looks down at himself and realizes the horrifying truth. He's no longer a Pacu. Somehow, the glowing pod has turned him into a Jovin. Panicking, Ali tries to explain that it's really him, but the Pacu won't listen. Hearing his voice come out of a Jovin only convinces them something even worse has happened. They assume the bird somehow ate Ali and stole his voice. Terrified and furious, they attack him. Trying to escape the chaos, Ali runs blindly through the dark until he slips near a cliff's edge and plunges into the wilderness below. The next morning, Ali wakes up far from home, exhausted, frightened, and completely alone. Before he can process what's happened, two Jovin approach him cautiously, clearly puzzled by his behavior. One introduces herself as Ivy and explains that her sisters, Violet and Lily, helped rescue him after the fall. Concerned about his condition, they want to bring him back to Jovin Rock so he can recover. But Ali refuses outright. By this point, he trusts no one. Furious and overwhelmed, he starts yanking feathers from his own body, unable to accept being trapped in a form that isn't his. Ivy and her sisters mistake this for confusion caused by injury, assuming the fall knocked something loose in his memory when he hit his head. Before they can calm him down, a chilling howl cuts through the forest. A fire wolf is close by. Without hesitation, Ivy reacts. She rubs crushed fruit over Ali to mask his scent, hides him carefully, and flies off with her sisters. Moments later, the massive predator arrives and searches the area. The tension is unbearable as the firewolf prowls around sniffing for prey, but after finding nothing, it eventually retreats into the forest. Once the danger passes, Ali wanders to a nearby lake to wash himself off. There he meets a fisher named Bool. After hearing Ali's whole story about the glowing pod, Bool reveals he's actually seen another one near a giant hollow tree deeper in the valley. That gives Ali instant hope, and determined to return to normal, he rushes toward the spot Bool described. Sure enough, he finds another glowing pod, hidden high above the ground. There's just one problem. He still doesn't know how to fly. That's when Ivy reappears. She offers to help him reach the pod, but only if he agrees to come back with her afterward. With no better option, Ali reluctantly agrees. Almost immediately, though, everything goes wrong. Before Ali can stop her, Ivy accidentally touches the pod herself and instantly transforms into a Pacu. Both of them instantly realize the disaster they've caused. Ali is devastated, since the pod was his only shot at becoming normal again, while Ivy stares at her tiny new body in disbelief and frustration. Now stuck in the same nightmare together, Ivy finally learns the whole truth about Ali and the pods. With no way to reverse the change, the two realize their only option is to keep searching the valley for another pod. Soon after, Ali finds Bool again and rushes over for answers. Bool explains that these magical pods usually grow out of the remains of fallen Zoa, the ancient beings the firewolves wiped out long ago, and points them toward another possible location, near a massive waterfall. Ali and Ivy head for the towering cliffs around the falls. The climb is tough, especially for Ali, who still hasn't mastered his wings. Partway up, another distant howl forces them to hide. Nearby, they spot a small wolf pup wandering around, apparently searching for its father. Distracted, Ali and Ivy start arguing and fail to notice the real danger closing in. A full pack of adult wolves has surrounded them. The wolves attack without warning, forcing Ali and Ivy into a frantic escape. As the predators close in, Ivy keeps telling Ali to fly, but panic keeps ruining his attempts. Desperate, they dash into a nearby cave. Only then do they realize something strange. The wolves stop at the entrance and refuse to go in. Ivy immediately senses something even worse might be lurking deeper inside. Sure enough, the cave is crawling with root snakes, deadly creatures that hunt by sensing vibrations rather than sight or sound. Now they're trapped between wolves outside and monsters within. Thinking fast, Ali comes up with a dangerous plan: move through the cave without disturbing the snakes. The problem is that the floor is covered in tangled roots, making it nearly impossible to tell which ones are harmless and which are sleeping predators. Ali remembers that the Pacu have a special sense-based ability, and since Ivy is now transformed into one, he suggests she use it to guide them safely through. Slowly, the pair navigates between the sleeping root snakes as Ivy follows the scent trails through the darkness. For a while, the plan works, but just as they near the exit, the wolves outside let out another loud howl, and the vibrations jolt the snakes awake. The cave erupts into chaos. Giant root snakes lunge from every direction as Ali and Ivy sprint for their lives. Unfortunately, their escape route ends abruptly at a cliff edge inside the cavern. With the snakes seconds away, Ivy makes a split-second call as she shoves Ali off the ledge. Terrified, Ali plummets through the darkness while Ivy shouts instructions on how to control his wings. He panics at first, but then something clicks. At the last possible second, Ali spreads his wings correctly and catches the air for the first time. He flies. The two narrowly escape and land safely far from the cave. Exhausted but relieved, Ali thanks Ivy sincerely for believing in him. Buoyed by his success, he even offers to fly her straight to the waterfall right away, but Ivy decides it's too risky to travel in the heavy fog and darkness, and suggests waiting until morning. That night, while they rest, Ivy opens up about her past. She explains that after the zoo disappeared, the Jovin lost their main food source. Her people survived on a special route, but it was never quite enough. Life became brutal for the Jovin after the zoo vanished. Starvation spread fast, and many didn't make it, including Ivy's own parents. As the oldest sibling, she had to grow up fast, fighting every day to find enough food for Violet, Lily, and the rest of the flock, even though most of them never fully understood what she sacrificed for them. Eventually, she discovered Piplets, and that discovery kept the Jovin alive. As Ali listens, a painful realization hits him. Years ago, he was the young Pacu who taught a baby Jovin how to crack open Piplets. That single act of kindness may have unintentionally triggered the food shortage that later devastated his own people. The thought leaves him speechless. By sunrise, the two finally reach the massive waterfall Boole described. Ali carries Ivy through the air as they search the cliffs, and before long, they spot the remains of a fallen zoo. Their excitement fades fast, though, once they realize it's sitting right inside a firewolf den. Just then, Boole shows up with a risky plan. He'll distract the wolves while Ali and Ivy sneak in for the pod. Ali is stunned that Boole would take such a risk, but the fish finally admits the truth. He's been alone for a very long time, and for the first time in years, he feels like he actually has real friends. More than anything, he dreams of transforming into a creature that can live on land, so he can stay with them for good. Ivy promises that once they find enough pods, they'll help make that happen. Hearing that means everything to Boole. Without backing out, he launches the distraction, luring the wolves away from the den before diving safely back into the water. Taking advantage of the opening, Ali and Ivy sneak in and find a glowing pod among the remains of the zoo, but there's only one. Ivy suggests Ali let her use it first so she can return to normal and then help him find another, but instead of agreeing, Ali hesitates. Finally, he admits something he's been holding back the whole time. He was the little Pacu she met long ago, the same child who trusted a Jovin for the first time, only to watch her flock arrive and wipe out his people's harvest. The confession changes everything between them. Before either of them can respond, the fire wolves return, and chaos erupts. In the scramble, Ali and Ivy both grab the pod at once and accidentally activate it together. In a flash, they transform into fish, just like Boole, and dive into the water to escape the wolves. While hiding underwater, Ivy pieces together the truth about the pods, and the transformation depends on what the person says while activating them. That realization only frustrates Ali more. Furious and exhausted, He blames Ivy for everything that's happened to him. Now trapped in a body even further from his true self, he insists they were never meant to trust each other in the first place. Hurt, Ivy angrily decides they should go their separate ways. But just as Ali starts to swim off alone, Boole stops him with important news. There are still more pods hidden somewhere in the valley, and he knows exactly where. After a long pause, Ali reluctantly turns back and follows. Boole explains the next batch of pods is near the most dangerous place in the entire valley, the towering rock falls. The climb is too much for any one creature to survive alone, which means teamwork is their only shot. The journey to the falls forces Ivy to finally confront her own guilt. She sincerely apologizes to Ali, admitting that everything she did in the past came from desperation and fear for her siblings' survival. This time, Ali really listens, and slowly forgives her as the tension between them finally starts to heal. Soon the group reaches the roaring rock falls, where dozens of glowing pods shimmer high above the crashing water. But reaching them looks nearly impossible. Boole suggests they combine their strength to propel themselves upward together. The plan seems promising at first until the rocks themselves start moving. The cliffs are alive. Massive stone-like predators emerge from the walls and attack without warning. Working together, Ali, Ivy, and Boole barely escape the creatures and keep climbing. But when they finally reach the top, another danger is already waiting. A pack of fire wolves. In the chaos, one of the wolf cubs loses its footing and dangles helplessly near the edge. Boole urges the others to ignore it and focus on grabbing the pods before the wolves attack, but Ali refuses to abandon the cub. Instead of thinking only of themselves, Ali and Ivy risk everything to save it, using teamwork and a clever swinging maneuver to pull the baby wolf back to safety, proving that compassion matters more than fear or survival. Eventually they reach the pods and successfully return to their original forms. But the victory doesn't last. Without warning, Boole uses one of the remaining pods on himself and transforms into something horrifying as the legendary fire wolf. The shocking truth comes out. Boole was the monster from the old stories all along. Long ago, after being betrayed and abandoned, he let his pain and anger consume him, and his obsession with power turned him into the very creature that once devastated the valley, before he eventually ended up trapped in the weak body of a fish. Now restored, he admits he spent years waiting for naive creatures foolish enough to trust him so he could regain his full strength. Desperate to stop him, Ivy tries transforming into something stronger, but the fight goes badly and she's seriously injured. The firewolf then destroys the last remaining pod, wiping out any chance of using it against him. As the monster heads off to unleash destruction on the valley once more, Ali faces an agonizing choice. Instead of chasing revenge, he chooses to save Ivy. For days he carries her across the wilderness until they finally reach Jovin Rock. After several days of recovery, Ivy heals. During that time, Ali starts to realize that despite all his mistakes, many of his actions unintentionally helped others survive and thrive. Unfortunately, peace doesn't last. Now fully restored, Boole tears through the valley again, spreading destruction everywhere he goes. Refusing to let history repeat itself, Ali steps up and unites the creatures of the valley, organizing a massive evacuation to the one place safe from the firewolf, Cuckoo Island. Even the firewolves join the rescue, repaying Ali for saving the wolf cub earlier. As the final showdown nears, Ali comes up with a dangerous plan inspired by the ancient past. Calling on the spirit and power of the Zoo, he gains the ability to transform and prepares to face the firewolf directly. Ali confronts Boole in a final battle, and at first the plan seems to be working, but it falls apart fast. The firewolf overpowers Ali and nearly destroys him, engulfing his body in flames. With no other option left, Ali makes one final sacrifice. Using the last of his strength, he drags Boole into the massive waterfall below, trapping and defeating him for good, even if it costs Ali his own life. Months later, the valley has completely changed. Peace has returned, and creatures of every kind now live together in harmony. Even the zoo begin returning to the land, restoring life to the valley once more. All of it happened because one small creature chose unity over fear. Then comes the final twist. Ali is found alive. When Ivy sees him again, he explains that their zoo rescued him after the battle. His parents are overwhelmed with relief to learn their son survived, and for the first time in a long while, the valley truly feels like a place filled with help instead of fear. When Swapped first came out, almost nobody expected it to become one of the biggest surprises in recent animated movies. There was no massive marketing campaign dominating the internet, no endless trailers forcing hype down people's throats. In fact, a lot of people stumbled onto this movie completely by accident, as some found it randomly on Netflix, others clicked because Michael B. Jordan's name was attached, and plenty of viewers went in expecting nothing more than a forgettable kids movie. But then something unexpected happened. People started getting emotionally attached to it. That's the fascinating thing about Swapped. It didn't arrive with the pressure of being the next Pixar masterpiece or a billion-dollar franchise starter. Instead, it quietly built momentum through word of mouth, and the reactions were surprisingly emotional. Again and again, viewers described the same experience. Low expectations followed by genuine shock at how much the film affected them. Some admitted they nearly turned it off in the opening minutes, assuming they already knew exactly what kind of movie this was: a cute fantasy creatures, bright animation, a familiar body swap setup, safe family entertainment. But as the story unfolded, many of those same viewers found themselves fully invested. And that turnaround became one of the defining conversations around the film. A huge number of reactions describe Swapped as an unexpected gem, not because it reinvents animation or storytelling, but because it connects emotionally in ways audiences simply didn't see coming. Viewers repeatedly mentioned being caught off guard by how sincere the movie felt. The emotional moments weren't treated as cheap manipulation, they were built slowly through character relationships, guilt, empathy, and growth. That sincerity mattered, especially in today's animation landscape, where audiences are increasingly worn out by sequels, recycled formulas, and movies that feel more like marketing products than genuine stories. Swapped arrived at a time when a lot of viewers had grown skeptical of modern animated films in general. Many admitted they had trust issues with newer studios or streaming exclusive releases, expecting this one to disappoint them the same way past projects had. Instead, it became the movie that surprised them. Interestingly, even people who criticized the film still seemed caught off guard by certain parts of it, which matters, because the conversation around Swapped was never simply masterpiece versus terrible movie. It became far more divided and emotional than that. Some audiences adored it, calling it heartfelt, beautiful, and emotionally powerful. Others found it average, predictable, or visually impressive but emotionally shallow. Yet even the critics tended to acknowledge the strength of its visuals, emotional intent, or central themes, and that divide is part of what makes the reception so interesting. For emotionally driven viewers, Swapped worked incredibly well. Families talked about laughing together, crying together, and unexpectedly bonding with the characters. Parents mentioned their kids becoming fully invested almost immediately. Some viewers admitted the ending genuinely moved them, which they hadn't expected from a movie they'd clicked on casually. Others described it as the kind of animated experience they'd been missing from older family films: a sincere, warm, and emotionally direct without leaning on cynicism or constant sarcasm. That nostalgia factor played a big role in the reception. A lot of people compared the emotional feel of Swapped to classic Disney, Pixar, or DreamWorks films, not necessarily because it reaches the same storytelling heights, but because it carries that same emotional sincerity those older films often had. It wanted to tell one complete, meaningful story instead of simply setting up sequels. Then there's the other side of the reaction. Some viewers felt the praise was exaggerated, arguing the visuals were propping up weaker writing, or that the story was too predictable and emotionally obvious. A few even questioned why audience ratings were so much higher than the actual storytelling seemed to warrant. That divide became part of the movie's identity, and this wasn't a universally worshipped phenomenon. It was a film that connected so strongly with some audiences that they overlooked its flaws entirely, while others focused almost exclusively on the weaknesses. But regardless of where people landed, one thing stayed constant: almost nobody expected Swap to spark this much discussion in the first place. That's what makes its reception so unique. People weren't debating whether a heavily marketed blockbuster lived up to impossible hype. They were arguing because a relatively quiet animated release unexpectedly resonated with a huge number of viewers. In the end, Swap didn't take off because audiences thought it was flawless. It took off because they were surprised by how much they cared. The movie quietly turned skepticism into emotional investment, casual curiosity into genuine attachment. Whether people ended up loving it or criticizing it, many walked away feeling like they'd found something more heartfelt than they'd bargained for. That element of surprise became the film's greatest strength before the story had even really begun. The body swap concept is one of the oldest tricks in family entertainment. We've seen it in comedies, fantasy films, cartoons, and live-action movies alike. Sometimes funny, sometimes emotional, but almost always predictable. Two characters swap bodies, struggle through each other's lives, learn a lesson about empathy, and return to normal with a better understanding of one another. So when Swapped introduces itself as another body swap movie, it's easy to assume you already know what's coming. But surprisingly, the film finds a way to make the formula feel fresh again, and the reason it works is that Swapped understands something a lot of body swap stories forget. Perspective isn't just emotional, it's physical. Instead of swapping two similar human characters, the movie builds its whole premise around creatures that experience the world in completely different ways. Ali belongs to the forest floor, close to the ground, dependent on scent and touch, shaped by caution. Ivy belongs to the open sky, built for speed, height, freedom, and aerial instinct. That difference changes everything. The movie doesn't treat the swap as a gimmick built purely for laughs. It treats it as a matter of survival. Suddenly, both characters are trapped in bodies that completely change how they move through the world. Flying stops being graceful and becomes terrifying. Basic movement becomes dangerous. Even ordinary senses feel foreign. That's where the film gets more interesting than expected. It turns the body swap formula into an exploration of physical identity itself. Ali doesn't just become a bird, he experiences what it means to exist above the world he's always known. The sky suddenly feels enormous, unstable, and threatening. Meanwhile, Ivy is forced into a grounded existence where every movement feels smaller, slower, and more vulnerable than what she's used to. The film keeps reminding us these aren't just two characters who changed appearances, they've lost the physical reality that shaped their entire understanding of life. That gives the premise real emotional weight, because once those differences are established, the body swap stops being about comedy and starts being about empathy through lived experience. The characters aren't guessing what the other person feels anymore, they're forced to survive it themselves. That's the key to why the concept works. The movie understands that real empathy is uncomfortable. It's not just saying I understand you now, it's being forced into situations where you physically feel another person's fears, limitations, and instincts. Swap chooses fantasy to externalize that process in a very direct way. And that's smarter than the film first lets on. The physical contrast between the two worlds also creates a compelling dynamic throughout the adventure. The forest floor and the open sky feel almost like separate civilizations, one intimate, hidden, and rooted in caution. The other expansive, dangerous, and free. By forcing Ali and Ivy to survive in environments they weren't built for, The movie generates tension naturally instead of leaning on artificial conflict. Even the comedy grows out of this concept, the humor isn't random slapstick, it comes from genuine physical incompatibility, characters struggling to adapt to instincts they don't understand, learning to fly, learning to navigate by smell, learning just how vulnerable another species really feels in its everyday life. Because the movie commits to those physical differences, the body swap premise gains real authenticity. A lot of body swap stories eventually stop caring about the mechanics of the switch. A swap actually leans into them, constantly exploring how different species experience danger, movement, fear, and survival. That attention to detail makes the world feel more believable even within a fantasy setting. At the same time, the film never loses sight of the bigger emotional metaphor underneath it all. Walking in someone else's shoes becomes the literal foundation of the story, not through speeches or forced moral lessons, but through lived experience. The characters start out carrying assumptions about each other's worlds and struggles, but once they're forced to actually live inside those realities, those assumptions slowly fall apart. Fear turns into understanding, frustration turns into respect, and eventually survival itself depends on cooperation. That emotional progression is what elevates the premise beyond a simple kids' movie gimmick. Of course, the movie still hits plenty of familiar genre beats, predictable bonding moments, expected misunderstandings, emotional realizations audiences will see coming a mile away. Swap doesn't fully escape the formula, but it does something arguably more important. It finds genuine sincerity inside that formula. The movie truly believes perspective can change people, and that understanding others takes more than sympathy, it takes experience. By grounding the body swap in survival, physical adaptation, and emotional vulnerability, the story builds a stronger emotional core than many viewers expected. That's why the concept resonated so widely, not because it's revolutionary, but because it took an overused idea and reminded people why it worked in the first place. At its best, Swap turns a familiar fantasy setup into something much more human, a story about fear, misunderstanding, identity, and connection, all wrapped inside a deceptively simple body swap adventure. That's where the movie quietly succeeds, not by reinventing the formula, but by making it feel emotionally alive again. One of the biggest reasons Swapped pulls audiences into its story is the world building. Before the emotional themes fully land, before the twists, before the larger conflict even begins, the movie quietly establishes something important. The valley feels alive, not just visually beautiful, actually alive. That's a rare thing in modern animation. A lot of animated films build worlds that look impressive for a few minutes but feel hollow underneath, existing purely as colorful backdrops. Swapped avoids that trap almost immediately. From the moment the film starts exploring its environments, you can feel that this ecosystem existed long before the characters showed up. Every part of the valley feels interconnected. The forests don't just look pretty, they feel inhabited. The skies feel vast and dangerous. Underground spaces feel protective but fragile. Rivers, cliffs, plant life, glowing bods, and strange creatures all work together to create the sense of a real, living ecosystem rather than random fantasy decoration. Visually, the movie commits fully to that identity. The environmental design is packed with texture, movement, and organic detail. The color palette leans into natural greens, glowing blues, warm earth tones, and soft magical lighting that gives the world an almost dreamlike quality without disconnecting it from reality. It feels magical but still grounded enough that survival actually matters. That balance matters, because Swap doesn't want the valley to feel like a cartoon playground. It wants it to feel like nature, dangerous, beautiful, and unpredictable. That comes through especially clearly in the creature designs. Instead of ordinary animals, the film builds fantasy creatures that blend fauna and flora, some with plant-like textures growing from their bodies, others seemingly made of rock, leaves, roots, or glowing organic material. The result is a world where every species feels tied directly to its environment. Nothing feels disconnected from nature. And even the design philosophy reinforces the film's larger themes about coexistence and ecological balance. The creatures don't feel like separate cartoon mascots thrown into the same movie. They feel like organisms shaped by the same ecosystem, and because of that, the valley develops its own identity quickly. What's interesting is how the world building also strengthens the emotional storytelling. The physical divide between the forest floor and the open sky isn't just visual, it reflects two entirely different ways of living. Grounded creatures survive through caution, closeness, and staying hidden. Aerial creatures experience freedom, speed, and openness. The movie constantly shows how environment shapes perspective, which is exactly why the body swap premise works so well here. Ali and Ivy aren't just entering different bodies, they're entering entirely different worlds, with different rules, instincts, dangers, and social realities. The valley itself becomes part of the emotional lesson. Then there's the mythology. Swapped gradually introduces ancient stories, mysterious glowing pods, forgotten warnings, and creatures like the firewolf in ways that make the world feel older than the story we're watching. Like generations have lived through conflicts and fears long before Ali's journey even begins. The movie doesn't dump all its lore through non-stop exposition either, at least not early on. A lot of the best world building happens visually, through old environmental scars, strange ruins, tribal fears, and creature behavior patterns. The valley communicates its history through atmosphere before the characters ever fully explain it, and that gives the world real depth. Even viewers who criticized the screenplay often admitted the world itself felt immersive, because the environmental storytelling stays consistently strong throughout. Every location feels tied to the emotional and physical survival of the species that live there. Visually, the movie is stunning. The underwater scenes early on hook a lot of viewers immediately because of how immersive they feel. Light filters naturally through the water, movement feels soft and alive, and tiny environmental details make the ecosystem believable. Later, the film shifts into forests, cliffs, storms, and eventually large-scale fire sequences that completely transform the atmosphere. That fire sequence is one of the strongest payoffs of the world building, because by the time destruction arrives, audiences already understand what's at stake. The valley doesn't feel like disposable scenery, it feels like home. So when fire tears through it, the danger feels emotional as well as visual. Technically, the animation team really pushes themselves here. The smoke, lighting, environmental destruction, and scale all come together into sequences that feel massive without losing clarity. You can feel the heat, panic, and chaos spreading through a world the movie has spent so much time making you care about. Another reason the world resonates so strongly is that it avoids feeling artificial. Even though the creatures are fantastical, the ecosystem still follows emotional logic. Species depend on one another, food chains matter, environmental imbalance has consequences, and fear between communities creates real tension. Nature itself feels interconnected, and that interconnectedness becomes one of the film's strongest thematic ideas. The valley isn't just a magical fantasy backdrop, it's a reflection of coexistence. Every species affects another. Every action ripples outward, and the world constantly reinforces the movie's larger message that no community truly survives alone. Of course, not every viewer thought the world building was perfect. Some felt the film introduced fascinating ideas without exploring them deeply enough. Others wanted more time spent on the mythology, politics, or ecological rules of the world. A few critics argued the valley occasionally felt more decorative than narratively meaningful, and honestly, those criticisms are fair, since Swapped builds a world so visually rich that some viewers naturally wanted more time to explore it. The movie hints at deeper histories and larger systems it never fully digs into. But strangely, That incompleteness almost works in the film's favor. It makes the valley feel bigger than the story itself, like we only witnessed one chapter of something much larger, and that feeling lingers after the credits roll. That's why so many viewers said they wanted to return to this world again, not necessarily because the plot demanded a sequel, but because the environment itself felt worth continuing to explore. At its best, Swapped turns the valley into more than a setting. It becomes an emotional ecosystem, where survival, empathy, fear, prejudice, wonder, and connection are all woven directly into the world itself. Without that level of world building, the movie probably wouldn't have connected with audiences nearly as strongly as it did. If there's one thing almost everyone agrees on about Swapped, whether they loved it or hated it, it's that the animation is stunning. Even many of the harshest critics admitted the visuals were the strongest part of the whole experience, which says a lot in an era when audiences have become genuinely hard to impress visually. Big studios put out technically polished films every year. A high-end rendering, detailed lighting, cinematic camera work, those things are practically expected now. But Swapped still manages to stand out, not by overwhelming viewers with non-stop spectacle, but by understanding visual atmosphere. It knows how to build a world that feels textured, immersive, and emotionally tied to the story. From the very first scenes, the animation establishes its identity. The environments are rich with organic detail. Light moves naturally through water, forests, smoke, and fog, and tiny background elements are always shifting, making the valley feel alive even when nobody's talking. Nothing feels static. That's one of the film's biggest technical strengths. A lot of animated movies create beautiful still frames, but Swapped creates living ones. Grass bends subtly, particles drift through the air, water reflects shifting colors depending on the environment, and creature fur reacts dynamically to movement and light. The world constantly breathes around the characters, giving the film an incredible sense of immersion. The color work deserves real praise too. Swapped leans into rich natural tones, glowing greens, warm earth colors, deep blues, fiery oranges, but uses them with emotional intention rather than just cranking up the saturation. Different sections of the valley carry distinct visual moods. The forest floor feels intimate and protective, the skies feel vast and dangerous, the underwater sequences feel dreamlike and calm, and later the fire sequences turn the film into something intense and almost apocalyptic. That emotional use of color is what pushes the animation beyond simple technical polish. The visuals are constantly supporting the story's emotional tone. The creature designs are another major achievement. Instead of relying on ordinary animals, the film builds species that blend fauna and flora, some partially made of bark, roots, leaves, stone, or glowing organic textures, others combining familiar animal instincts with fantasy anatomy. The result is a world that feels original without becoming visually confusing, since every creature still moves with believable physical logic. That matters because, fantastical as the designs are, the animation team clearly focused on preserving weight, movement, and biological realism. Flying creatures move differently than grounded ones, small creatures react to danger differently than large predators, and environmental interaction constantly reinforces physical scale, all of which makes the fantasy feel believable. The technical rendering itself is also very strong. For detail, lighting behavior, environmental reflections, smoke simulation, and atmospheric effects all consistently look high-end. The water sequences in particular earned a lot of praise for how soft and immersive they feel. But the real showcase comes during the large-scale action and disaster sequences. The fire scenes are genuinely incredible, are some of the most visually impressive sequences in recent family animation. The scale of the destruction, the shifting light, the smoke behavior, and the environmental chaos all combine to create real tension. The movie suddenly shifts from warm fantasy adventure to something visually overwhelming and dangerous, And what makes those scenes work is that the fire never feels like empty spectacle, it feels emotional. By that point in the story, the valley already feels alive, so watching it burn creates genuine anxiety. The animation team isn't just showing destruction, they're showing panic spreading through an ecosystem the audience has already grown attached to. And that emotional connection gives the visuals a lot more power. Another impressive technical touch is how the film handles physical perspective during the body swap sequences. The camera movements and environmental scale subtly shift depending on which character is experiencing the world. When Ali is forced into aerial movement, the sky feels enormous and unstable, heights suddenly feel intimidating, and speed feels dangerous. Meanwhile, grounded environments feel tighter and more enclosed when seen from Ivy's new perspective. Those subtle visual shifts reinforce the emotional discomfort of the swap without needing constant dialogue to explain it. As smart filmmaking, since Swapped often communicates emotion visually better than it does through exposition-heavy dialogue. The lighting work throughout also deserves recognition. A soft environmental glow, sunset reflections, underwater diffusion, fire illumination. The movie consistently uses light to build atmosphere, and certain scenes almost look hand-painted because of how carefully the light blends into the environment. In fact, many viewers describe parts of the film as resembling painted artwork, and that's not accidental. The film clearly prioritizes visual softness over hyper-realistic sharpness. The result is a fantasy world that feels magical without losing texture or physical depth, landing somewhere between realism and storybook fantasy, a difficult balance to pull off. Interestingly, the visuals became strong enough that they actually shaped the audience divide over the movie itself. For viewers who connected emotionally with the story, the animation elevated everything even further. It amplified the emotional beats, strengthened the atmosphere, and made the world unforgettable. But for viewers who disliked the screenplay, the animation became almost frustratingly good, since many critics felt the technical artistry deserved a stronger script to match. Several reactions basically described the movie as visually extraordinary but narratively uneven, arguing that the world building, creature designs, and rendering quality were carrying weaker dialogue and predictable storytelling. And honestly, that criticism holds up. There are moments where the film feels more visually confident than narratively confident. The animation keeps pushing creative boundaries while the screenplay occasionally falls back on familiar formulas and exposition-heavy writing. Even so, the technical craftsmanship is undeniable. This is clearly a movie made by artists who deeply cared about creating an immersive visual experience. Every frame shows effort, every environment feels intentionally designed, every creature moves with personality, and even smaller scenes carry enough detail to make the world feel alive. In modern animation, audiences can tell the difference between something visually manufactured and something visually crafted, and Swapped feels crafted. It feels like the animators genuinely wanted viewers to get lost in this world. They wanted the environments to feel magical, the creatures to feel memorable, and the lighting, color, movement, and atmosphere to support the story at every turn. Whether viewers loved the film or picked it apart, one thing is hard to deny: the animation team absolutely delivered. At its best, Swapped isn't just visually beautiful, it's visually alive, a film where color, movement, lighting, texture, and atmosphere work together to create an animated world that stays with you long after the credits roll. At the heart of Swapped, underneath the fantasy creatures, the body swap adventure, the big themes, and the massive visual spectacle, there's one reason the movie works emotionally as often as it does: Ali. Without him, this story probably falls apart. A huge part of the audience's emotional connection comes from how relatable he is. Despite being a completely fictional creature, he's not written as some flawless hero destined to save the world from the start. He's curious, emotional, impulsive, kind-hearted, sometimes reckless, and above all, deeply human in the way he makes mistakes. That's what makes him compelling. Ali doesn't cause problems because he's selfish or malicious. He causes them because he genuinely wants to help. He believes in kindness, trusts too easily, and approaches the world with wonder instead of fear. Ironically, those exact qualities are what set disaster in motion around him. And that contradiction defines his whole character. The movie keeps putting Ali in situations where good intentions lead to painful consequences. He wants connection, understanding, and to prove himself useful. But the more he tries to do good without fully understanding the ecosystem around him, the more complicated things get. That's a surprisingly mature emotional foundation for a family movie. Because Swapped isn't just teaching kids that actions have consequences. It's teaching something more uncomfortable. Even kindness can hurt people if it isn't paired with understanding. That idea becomes the emotional core of Ali's arc. Throughout the film, he carries enormous guilt for the chain reaction his choices set off. And what makes that guilt land is that the audience understands exactly why he made those choices. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone, he genuinely believed helping one creature would lead to something good, and instead the situation spiraled beyond his control. That burden changes him over the course of the film. Early on, his curiosity feels almost childlike. The world is something exciting to explore. But once the consequences of his actions start affecting entire communities, that innocence slowly turns into responsibility. Importantly, the movie doesn't strip away his kindness or turn him cynical. Instead, it teaches him that compassion requires awareness. That's a far more interesting arc than simple bravery. Ali doesn't need to learn how to stop being afraid, he needs to learn how to understand the world before trying to change it, and because of that, his growth feels earned. The body swap premise deepens this growth even further. Once Ali is forced into Ivy's world, he no longer gets to experience life from the comfort of his own perspective. Suddenly vulnerability means something completely different. The sky feels terrifying. Survival becomes physical, fear becomes immediate. More importantly, he starts to see how other creatures experience the world emotionally, which is where his arc connects directly to the film's larger themes about empathy and coexistence. Ali's journey is essentially the movie's way of asking, how can you really understand someone until you've lived their reality yourself? And because he starts out already full of curiosity and emotional openness, he's the perfect character to carry that lesson. What also makes Ali effective is how emotionally vulnerable the movie lets him be. Modern animated protagonists often lean hard into constant sarcasm, exaggerated confidence, or hyperactive comedy. Ali is different. He's sensitive. He gets overwhelmed. He feels guilt deeply. He doubts himself. He worries about disappointing others. And the movie never mocks him for any of it. Instead, those emotions are exactly why audiences connect with him. Several of the film's emotional moments land specifically because viewers can feel how badly Ali wants to make things right. His guilt never feels performative, it feels personal. There's a sadness underneath his optimism that becomes more visible as the story goes on. And that honesty gives the movie a lot of its heart. His relationship with the valley itself matters a lot too. Ali isn't trying to become some legendary chosen hero. He just wants to belong, to contribute positively to his community, to stop being seen as someone who only causes trouble. That desire for acceptance makes him instantly relatable, especially for younger viewers, because underneath all the fantasy, Ali's struggle is universal. Most people know what it's like to make mistakes while trying to do the right thing, to carry guilt, to fear disappointing the people around them. Swap taps into that surprisingly well, and the movie is at its strongest whenever it slows down to sit with Ali's emotional state instead of rushing toward plot mechanics. Some of the best scenes are quiet ones, moments where you simply feel the weight he's carrying, where he questions himself, where Ivy challenges him emotionally, where he realizes the world is far more interconnected than he thought. Those are the scenes where the character truly comes alive. Michael B. Jordan deserves a lot of credit here too. His performance gives Ali warmth without making him feel naive to the point of being annoying. There's real sincerity in the voice work that keeps the character from becoming overly childish or exaggerated. Jordan understands that Ali works best played honestly. He treats the emotional moments seriously instead of pumping energy into every line, and that restraint makes the emotional scenes hit much harder, especially later in the film when Ali's guilt and exhaustion takes center stage. One of the film's strongest ideas is that mistakes don't have to permanently define you. That emotional release is crucial to the ending as the story keeps piling responsibility, fear, and self-blame onto Ali, but eventually lets him understand that growth matters more than perfection. That message resonates strongly, and not just with kids, with adults too, because Ali's journey is ultimately about learning to carry responsibility without destroying your own sense of self-worth. It's about understanding that intentions matter, but so does accountability. It's about realizing that empathy requires listening, learning, and sometimes accepting hard truths about your own actions. A surprisingly layered material for a fantasy family film. Of course, not everyone connected with Ali equally. Some viewers felt he occasionally came across as too emotionally straightforward or overly innocent. Others thought the screenplay didn't give him enough subtlety, and a few critics pointed out that his arc follows very familiar animated protagonist patterns. Fair criticism as the shape of his journey is recognizable. But what elevates Ali beyond cliché copyright is the sincerity behind it. The movie genuinely cares about his internal growth, treats his emotions seriously, and lets his mistakes actually matter, which is why audiences so often become attached to him even when the larger story gets uneven. That's why so many emotional reactions to swapped center specifically on Ali, not the twists, not the spectacle, not even the body swap concept itself. He's the emotional anchor holding everything together, giving the fantasy its grounding, the themes their human vulnerability, and the audience someone worth caring about long after the adventure ends. At its best, Swapped succeeds because Ali feels real in exactly the ways that matter. He wants to do good, he makes mistakes, he carries guilt, he learns empathy, and slowly, painfully, he grows. If Ali is the emotional heart of Swapped, Ivy is the force that keeps that heart beating. Because while the movie starts out as a body swap, a survival adventure, and a clash between different species, its real emotional core eventually boils down to something much simpler: a friendship. And that friendship is a big part of why the movie works as well as it does. At first, Ali and Ivy don't seem to fit together at all. They come from completely different worlds, shaped by different instincts, fears, and survival strategies. Ali stays close to the ground, cautious, community-minded, emotionally sensitive. Ivy belongs to the sky, freer, more independent, more confident navigating danger. The film keeps reinforcing that contrast, not just through dialogue but through movement, environment, and perspective itself. Even how they physically experience the world creates friction between them. One is used to openness and speed, the other to closeness and caution, and that difference means their relationship starts in discomfort rather than instant chemistry. That matters. Swap doesn't rush the connection, it lets the friendship build naturally through frustration, misunderstanding, and survival. Early on, the two clash constantly, Ali's emotional impulsiveness rubbing against Ivy's sharper confidence. Ivy isn't some instantly comforting guide, and Ali doesn't understand her world right away either. They annoy each other before they understand each other, which makes the relationship feel believable. A lot of animated friendships skip straight to bonding without earning it, but Swap takes it slow, forcing Ali and Ivy to depend on each other physically before they're emotionally ready to. That survival dynamic creates tension throughout the adventure, but slowly, quietly, things start to shift. As the arguments soften, the defensiveness fades, Curiosity replaces judgment, and the friendship gradually becomes real. What makes their dynamic work so well is that both characters fill in gaps in each other's personalities. Ali brings emotional openness and compassion into Ivy's life, while Ivy brings confidence, adaptability, and perspective into his. Neither one fixes the other, they expand each other's understanding of the world, which matters because the movie isn't trying to tell a story about opposites magically clicking together. It's a story about learning to value experiences completely different from your own, and Ivy is essential to that lesson. Throughout the film, she keeps challenging Ali, not cruelly, but honestly, pushing him to stop drowning in guilt and see that his mistakes don't erase his worth. At the same time, Ali helps Ivy understand emotional vulnerability in ways she may never have experienced before. The relationship transforms both of them. That emotional balance is what gives Swapped its strongest moments. Some of the most memorable scenes aren't the big action sequences or the twists, they're the quiet moments between Ali and Ivy, conversations during travel, small acts of trust, scenes where they stop seeing each other as representatives of rival species and start seeing each other as individuals. That shift is really the whole emotional point of the movie, and the body swap premise makes it even more powerful. Since Ali and Ivy aren't just learning about each other emotionally, they're physically living each other's realities. Every challenge deepens their understanding, every danger reveals vulnerability, every survival moment strips away another layer of prejudice and assumption. The movie essentially traps them inside empathy itself, and that's what makes the friendship feel so meaningful by the end. What's especially impressive is how the film avoids forcing sentimentality. The emotional scenes work because the movie earns them gradually, so by the time the characters fully trust each other, the audience already understands how hard that journey was for both of them. That's why the payoff lands so well for so many viewers. Several audience reactions specifically singled out Ali and Ivy's chemistry as the film's strongest element. Even viewers who criticized the writing or pacing often admitted the relationship kept them invested. Ultimately, the movie lives or dies on whether audiences believe in that connection, and most of the time, they do. A big part of that comes down to the voice acting. Michael B. Jordan and Juno Temple bring very different energies to their performances, and those differences complement each other beautifully. Jordan gives Ali warmth, vulnerability, and sincerity. Temple gives Ivy confidence and sharpness without losing the sensitivity underneath. Together, they create a dynamic that feels genuinely alive, a frustration in their arguments, playfulness in the lighter moments, pain in the emotional conflicts, and real care by the end of the journey. The performances let the relationship evolve naturally instead of feeling mechanically written, and that authenticity carries a lot of the movie, especially since Swapped sometimes falls into familiar storytelling patterns structurally. The plot occasionally gets predictable, certain twists divide audiences, and some dialogue scenes feel overly on the nose. But even in the weaker moments, Ali and Ivy keep the film emotionally grounded, and that humanity matters most in the later scenes. One of the strongest moments in the story comes when Ivy helps lift the crushing guilt Ali has carried for most of the film. It's not played as some big speech designed to force tears. It feels personal and quiet. That emotional support is the final step in Ali's growth, and Ivy is the one who gets him there. At the same time, Ali changes Ivy too, teaching her compassion beyond instinct, trust beyond survival, and emotional openness beyond independence. Their relationship becomes proof of the movie's central belief that understanding another person can genuinely change who you are, and that's why the friendship resonates so strongly with families. At its core, Swapped isn't really about magic pods, mythical creatures, or even the body swap itself. Those are just tools for telling a much more universal story about two people from completely different worlds learning to trust each other enough to grow together. That emotional simplicity is what makes the friendship powerful. Of course, not every viewer fully connected with the dynamic, as some felt it followed familiar animated movie formulas, Others thought the emotional development moved too fast, and a few critics wanted more tension before the payoff arrived. Fair points. But even so, it's hard to deny how much emotional energy the film pours into their bond. Swap genuinely believes in the power of friendship, believes empathy can break down fear, believes emotional connection can bridge communities divided by misunderstanding. Ali and Ivy embody all of that. That's why their relationship sticks with audiences long after the credits roll in, not because it's the most original friendship ever put on screen, but because it feels sincere, messy, and human. At its best, the bond between Ali and Ivy turns Swapped from a simple fantasy adventure into something genuinely meaningful, a story about trust, vulnerability, forgiveness, and discovering that the people most different from us might understand us best. One of the more interesting things about Swapped is that even though the emotional center belongs to Ali and Ivy, the world around them never feels empty. Everywhere they go, there are creatures, communities, legends, and relationships constantly shaping the film's emotional atmosphere, which matters, because a world this visually rich would feel hollow if the supporting cast didn't add something meaningful to it. To be fair, not every supporting character in Swapped is deeply developed. One of the movie's most common criticisms is that a lot of the secondary characters fall into familiar archetypes, with some viewers arguing the side cast lacks complexity or exists mainly to move the plot along. But despite that, the supporting relationships still play a big role in making the movie feel emotionally alive, especially in how they shape Ali's journey. The clearest example is Boole. He starts out as one of the strangest presences in the film, awkward, unpredictable, funny in a chaotic way. The kind of character you're trained not to take seriously. That's exactly why his role becomes so memorable later, because the movie gradually turns him into something far more emotionally complicated. Without spoiling the mechanics too much, Boole ends up deeply tied to one of the film's biggest emotional and narrative turns. What starts as comic relief slowly reveals itself as a mask for hidden pain, fear, and fragmentation. That shift completely changes how you interpret his earlier behavior, and it's part of why the character is so divisive. Some viewers loved the surprise, appreciating that a goofy supporting character got real emotional depth underneath the humor. Others felt the transformation was too abrupt or not fully earned by the script. Either way, Boole leaves an impression, because he embodies one of the film's central ideas: you never fully know what someone is carrying inside, and that ambiguity gives his relationship with Ali and Ivy a lot more weight than it first appears to have. Beyond Boole, the movie constantly uses its supporting creatures to reinforce its themes of empathy, coexistence, and interconnectedness. The valley feels full of communities carrying long histories, fears, and survival instincts. Different species distrust each other, old legends shape modern behavior, and fear spreads between groups that barely understand one another, reflecting larger social tensions underneath the fantasy, which is part of why the supporting cast matters even with limited screen time. Take Ali's relationship with his own community, for example. From the start, you can feel how badly he wants acceptance. He's not treated like a hero, he's treated like someone whose curiosity keeps causing problems. And that tension explains why he's so desperate to prove himself useful. The people around him constantly reinforce that insecurity. Family relationships play a surprisingly meaningful role too. The older generations carry stories, warnings, myths, and emotional scars the younger characters don't fully understand yet. Ali's grandmother, especially, helps establish the emotional history of the valley. Through her stories, the film builds a sense that these creatures are part of a much older cycle of fear, misunderstanding, and survival, and those generational relationships add real depth to the world building. The movie quietly suggests that prejudice and fear are often inherited long before they're ever questioned. Younger characters grow up carrying assumptions passed down by their elders, And that dynamic becomes especially important once Ally and Ivy start challenging the boundaries between species. That's where the supporting cast is most valuable. They represent the very systems Ally and Ivy are trying to break through. The communities themselves almost function as characters in their own right. Fearful, protective, shaped by survival, shaped by misunderstanding. Together, they reinforce the idea that coexistence is hard, because everyone carries emotional baggage they barely understand themselves. At the same time, a lot of these creatures bring genuine warmth to the film. Some relationships exist purely to provide comfort, humor, or grounding during heavy stretches of the story. Small interactions between creatures make the valley feel lived in, and background characters react to danger, loss, fear, and hope in ways that reinforce the sense of an emotionally interconnected ecosystem, where no creature truly exists alone. Every species affects another, and every emotional choice ripples outward. Of course, not every viewer thought the side characters were handled well. One of the most common criticisms of Swapped is that a lot of the supporting cast feels underdeveloped. Some argued that, outside of Ally and Ivy, very few characters get enough depth to be memorable, while others wished the film had spent more time exploring the personalities and relationships it introduced. That's a fair critique. There are moments where the world feels so rich that you naturally want more time with certain characters. Some arcs feel compressed, some emotional transitions happen fast, and a few characters seem built more around symbolism and individual personality. But interestingly, even those shortcomings say something true about the film. Swapped is less focused on individual side character complexity and more focused on emotional ecosystems. The relationships matter more than isolated arcs. The movie keeps asking how communities shape individuals, how fear spreads socially, how guilt spreads emotionally, and how empathy can slowly heal divisions between groups, which is why even small creature interactions feel meaningful, contributing to the valley's overall emotional atmosphere. The supporting cast also helps balance the film's tone. Without them, Swapped could easily turn emotionally heavy too fast. Some characters bring humor, others bring mythological mystery, others create tension or pressure, and together they let the movie shift constantly between warmth, adventure, fear, and vulnerability. That variety strengthens the world. Even when certain supporting characters are simple, they make the valley feel populated by lives beyond the main story, which matters because audiences can sense when an animated world revolves entirely around its protagonists. Swapped avoids that trap. Its creatures have histories, instincts, and emotional lives that continue outside of Ally and Ivy's immediate perspective, and that's what gives the film its emotional scale. By the end, the supporting relationships become part of the payoff themselves. Ally's journey isn't just personal redemption, it's about reconnecting broken relationships across entire communities, proving that fear, misunderstanding, and inherited division don't have to define the future. The supporting cast is essential to landing that larger message. At its best, Swapped uses its supporting characters not as side distractions but as emotional extensions of the world itself. Creatures carrying fear, hope, history, guilt, survival instinct, and emotional wounds that all tie back to the film's central idea, that understanding each other is the only way the valley survives together. Underneath the fantasy creatures, the magical body swapping, the adventure sequences, and the stunning animation, Swapped is ultimately driven by one thing above all, its message. And the movie wears that message proudly. This isn't a film hiding its themes behind layers of irony or cynicism. It wants audiences, especially families and kids, to walk away understanding exactly what it was trying to say. For some viewers, that directness was one of the film's greatest strengths. For others, it occasionally felt too obvious. Either way, the emotional themes became the film's true identity. At its core, Swapped is about empathy, not shallow just be nice to people empathy, but real empathy. The kind that forces you to actually experience someone else's fears, struggles, and vulnerabilities before you can truly understand them. That idea drives the entire story. The body swap premise isn't just a fantasy device, it's the movie's way of physically forcing characters into perspectives they'd never have chosen for themselves. And that changes everything. Before the swap, Ali and Ivy only understand each other through assumptions, fear, and inherited ideas about how other species behave. Once they're trapped inside each other's realities, those assumptions start collapsing almost immediately. The movie keeps asking one powerful question: how differently would we treat each other if we actually understood what life felt like on the other side? That question echoes through nearly every major emotional beat in the story. The valley itself is built on division. A different species fear and misunderstand one another, protecting themselves from outsiders based on old stories and inherited prejudices and survival instincts. The film quietly suggests a lot of that fear exists simply because nobody truly understands the other side's struggles, and that's where the messaging gets surprisingly mature. Swapped isn't just telling kids to be kind, it's telling them that understanding people takes effort, discomfort, and emotional openness. That's a much deeper lesson. The movie keeps emphasizing that empathy isn't passive, it requires listening, adapting, and accepting painful truths, including the truth that your own perspective is incomplete. Ali learns this through guilt and responsibility. Ivy learns it through vulnerability and trust. Together, their journey becomes a metaphor for breaking down fear between communities, and that sincerity is a big part of why it resonated so strongly with families. The film also puts enormous weight on interconnectedness. Every action in the valley has consequences somewhere else. A single decision affects entire ecosystems, one misunderstanding spreads fear across multiple communities, and the film keeps reinforcing the idea that no creature truly survives alone. Nature here isn't treated as scenery, it's treated as a living network, where species depend on one another. Ecosystems require balance, and survival is collective rather than individual. The movie repeatedly reminds audiences that selfishness, fear, and division eventually hurt everyone, not just one group, which is why its environmental themes feel emotionally tied to the character arcs instead of existing as random moral lessons. The film understands that environmental collapse often starts with emotional disconnection. When communities stop understanding each other, balance disappears. At the same time, Swapped strongly emphasizes accountability. And this is where Ali's journey becomes especially important. The film doesn't let him off the hook just because his intentions were good. Instead, it explores the painful reality that good intentions can still cause real harm. Ali spends much of the film carrying guilt for consequences he never wanted, and that gives the story surprising maturity. Since a lot of children's movies simplify morality into heroes versus villains, Swapped takes a more emotional approach, suggesting people can make damaging choices without being bad people. Mistakes matter, consequences matter, but so does growth. That balance between accountability and forgiveness is central to the film's emotional payoff. One of its most powerful ideas is that emotional growth begins when characters stop defining themselves entirely by their failures. Ali learns responsibility without losing his kindness. Ivy learns vulnerability without losing her strength. Even the supporting relationships reinforce that emotional healing takes cooperation, not isolation. That optimism is one reason so many viewers connected with the film. Swapped genuinely believes people can change, that fear can be overcome, that empathy can rebuild broken relationships, and in an entertainment landscape often dominated by cynicism, that sincerity feels refreshing to a lot of audiences. The movie also puts heavy emphasis on family and community. Parents, grandparents, siblings, and social groups all shape how the characters see the world. Older generations pass down stories, fears, and warnings that influence younger characters long before they form their own views. That generational thread matters thematically. The film quietly suggests that prejudice and fear are often inherited emotionally, with characters growing up believing certain creatures are dangerous simply because those fears have existed for generations. Ally and Ivy's friendship feels revolutionary precisely because it challenges those inherited boundaries, giving the movie broader social meaning without ever becoming preachy. Fundamentally, it's a story about breaking cycles of misunderstanding. Maybe the most emotionally effective part of the messaging is how the film ties empathy directly to survival. In Swapped, coexistence isn't presented as some optional ideal, it's necessary. The valley can't survive if species keep fearing and isolating themselves from one another. Communities have to cooperate, creatures have to learn from each other, and emotional division eventually turns into physical destruction. That's why the film's themes feel so tightly woven into the environment, the conflict, and the relationships all at once. Even the lighter themes tie back into this structure. A friendship matters because it breaks down fear. Trust matters because survival requires vulnerability. Kindness matters because emotional cruelty spreads just as fast as compassion does. The movie keeps emphasizing that emotional choices ripple out to affect entire communities, not just individuals. Not everyone thought the messaging was handled perfectly. Of course, one common criticism is that the themes occasionally get too on the nose, as some viewers felt the dialogue over-explained emotions instead of letting subtext breathe, while others thought certain ideas got oversimplified into overly safe moral lessons aimed squarely at kids. Fair enough, there are moments where the film clearly favors emotional clarity over subtlety, with some lessons repeated more than once and some emotional beats landing with very little ambiguity. But strangely, that same openness is part of why the movie connected with so many people. Swapped isn't trying to be emotionally distant or intellectually detached. It wants audiences to feel things openly, to cry openly, care openly, believe openly. Whether viewers loved or disliked the execution, that sincerity was impossible to ignore. A lot of animated films today hide behind sarcasm, self-awareness, or non-stop comedy. Swapped does the opposite, leaning fully into emotional vulnerability. It believes family films can say something meaningful without embarrassment, and that confidence gives the movie real emotional power, even when the writing gets uneven. At its best, Swapped becomes more than a fantasy adventure. It's a story about understanding people before judging them, about accepting responsibility without losing hope, about learning that fear grows strongest wherever empathy disappears, and ultimately about realizing that survival, emotional, social, and environmental, depends on how willing we are to see ourselves in each other. One of the hardest things for any family animated movie to pull off is balancing emotion and comedy without undercutting either one. Lean too far into seriousness and younger audiences check out. Lean too far into non-stop jokes and the emotional beats lose their impact. Swapped threads that needle for most of its runtime, and that balance is a big reason it connected with so many families. Because underneath all the visual spectacle and emotional messaging, the film understands that family entertainment works best when warmth comes before spectacle. And Swapped is full of warmth. The humor here isn't built on constant pop culture references, cynical sarcasm, or hyperactive joke delivery. Most of it grows naturally out of character interaction, physical awkwardness, and the contrast between personalities. That gives the comedy a softer, more timeless feel. The body swap premise is obviously the biggest early source of laughs. Watching creatures struggle to function in bodies completely unsuited to their instincts creates a lot of genuinely funny moments. Flying becomes terrifying instead of graceful. Grounded movement becomes awkward and frustrating. Simple survival tasks turn chaotic because the characters no longer understand their own bodies. Importantly, the film commits to those physical differences, which is why the humor works. The swap feels genuinely uncomfortable rather than magically easy. Ally and Ivy don't instantly adapt. They panic, fail, overreact, misread situations, and embarrass themselves constantly, and that awkwardness is a huge part of the film's charm. What makes the comedy effective, though, is that it rarely feels disconnected from the emotional storytelling. The jokes aren't there just to distract kids every few minutes. Most of the humor actually reinforces the film's larger themes about perspective and adaptation. The characters laugh because they don't understand each other, yet the audience laughs because they can see just how different these two worlds really are. And slowly, that comedy turns into emotional understanding, a transition the film handles surprisingly smoothly. The relationship between Allie and Ivy also generates a lot of the humor. Their personalities clash constantly early on, Allie's emotional sensitivity and impulsive curiosity colliding with Ivy's sharper confidence and survival instincts creates natural tension and comedy at the same time. The film gets a lot of mileage out of watching them frustrate each other, and those interactions actually help the friendship feel more believable later, since the characters don't instantly sync up emotionally. They argue, misunderstand each other, react differently to danger, and approach problems with completely different mindsets, and the humor grows directly out of those differences. That matters, because it keeps the film from getting emotionally heavy too fast. Swapped deals with guilt, fear, prejudice, survival, environmental collapse, and accountability, themes that could easily overwhelm younger viewers without lighter moments to balance them out. The comedy acts almost like breathing room between the more intense scenes, and for a lot of families, that balance worked really well. Plenty of audience reactions specifically mentioned how the film made them laugh while still hitting them emotionally later on. Parents described their kids staying fully engaged throughout, moving naturally between laughter and emotional investment without losing interest. That rhythm matters in family storytelling, since kids often process emotional scenes better when there's lighter material around them. And Swapped seems very aware of that, carefully shifting tone so younger viewers stay comfortable even during the darker stretches. Some of the humor lands better than expected for adults too. Several viewers mentioned being caught off guard by certain jokes they didn't expect from what initially looked like a straightforward kids movie. The comedy is rarely edgy, but it's grounded enough emotionally that older audiences can still enjoy it. Tracy Morgan's character in particular became a major source of comedic energy. His unpredictable delivery and chaotic personality drive a lot of the film's loudest laughs, and for some viewers, he steals every scene he's in, helping balance out the heavier themes and keep the adventure feeling energetic. But he's also one of the more divisive parts of the movie. Some audiences found him hilarious and memorable, others found him annoying, overly chaotic, or tonally distracting. That divide reflects the film's humor as a whole. While a lot of viewers loved the softer, wholesome comedic style, others felt it occasionally got repetitive or too simplistic. Some jokes follow familiar animated movie rhythms, some gags clearly target younger kids more than older viewers, and a few slapstick moments run a bit longer than they need to. Those are fair criticisms. Swapped is designed first and foremost as a family film, and it prioritizes accessibility over sharp satire or layered comedy. So some adults looking for edgier humor may find parts of it overly safe or predictable. But that simplicity is also part of why the film resonated emotionally with families. Swapped doesn't lean on crude humor, heavy sarcasm, foul language, or the kind of cynical comedy that dominates a lot of modern animation. Several viewers specifically praised it for feeling wholesome in a way that recalled older family films, and that sincerity matters, because the humor is constantly trying to create emotional comfort rather than ironic distance. It wants audiences to relax into the world, enjoy the adventure, and laugh with the characters rather than at them, and that warmth becomes part of the movie's identity. Even the visual comedy supports this atmosphere. Creature reactions, exaggerated movement, awkward physical adaptation during the body swap sequences all feel playful without becoming exhausting, and the animation team clearly knew how to use physical movement to support the comedic tone naturally. Importantly, the humor rarely undercuts the emotional scenes, one of the film's smartest tonal choices. A lot of family films sabotage their most emotional beats by immediately breaking tension with a joke, afraid of sitting in genuine sincerity for too long. Swapped, surprisingly, lets emotional scenes breathe when sadness, guilt, fear, or vulnerability show up. The movie often lets those feelings sit naturally instead of rushing to diffuse them, and that restraint gives the emotional payoff a lot more power later. The comedy supports the emotional journey instead of weakening it, and that balance may be one of the film's most underrated strengths. Even viewers who criticized the screenplay often admitted the movie stayed easy to watch from start to finish. The emotional pacing, humor, adventure, and visual spectacle all combine to keep the film moving. It rarely feels emotionally exhausting, and it rarely feels overly childish either. Instead, it stays in that tricky middle ground where both kids and adults can engage with the story for different reasons, which is why so many families described watching it together so positively. Kids connected with the adventure, the creatures, and the humor. Adults connected more with the emotional themes underneath, and the comedy acted as the bridge between those two experiences. At its best, Swapped understands that family entertainment isn't just about making kids laugh, it's about creating shared emotional experiences, moments where kids feel wonder, parents feel warmth, and both can invest in the same story at the same time. That's a genuinely difficult balance to strike, and even when the humor occasionally repeats itself or plays it too safe, the movie still succeeds because its comedy always comes from sincerity rather than cynicism. It wants audiences to smile, wants them to feel emotionally safe in this world, and ultimately that warmth becomes one of the biggest reasons the film leaves such a comforting impression once the credits roll. One of the biggest reasons Swapped connects emotionally even through some of its weaker writing is the voice acting. In animation, performance works differently. Actors don't have facial expressions or physical presence to lean on the way live action performers do. Everything has to come through rhythm, emotion, timing, vocal texture, and sincerity, and when animated performances fall short, even beautiful visuals can start to feel emotionally empty. Thankfully, Swapped mostly avoids that problem as the cast gives the film real emotional grounding. Starting with Michael B. Jordan as Ali. What makes Jordan's performance work is restraint. He doesn't play Ali like an exaggerated cartoon mascot, screaming energy into every line. Instead, he plays it sincerely, with warmth, vulnerability in the quieter moments, and a believable sense of emotional exhaustion later in the story. That honesty matters, because Ali's whole arc depends on the audience buying his guilt, compassion, curiosity, and confusion, and Jordan sells those emotions consistently. You can actually hear the difference in Ali before and after the swap. Early on, there's a softness and wonder that reflects how innocent his worldview still is, but as the consequences of his actions pile up, the performance shifts too. Fear becomes more audible, self-doubt creeps in, and the optimism starts to sound strained even as it holds on. That subtle evolution is a big reason audiences connect with the character so strongly. Jordan never forces the emotion, he lets it build, and that restraint gives the later scenes a lot more power. Juno Temple as Ivy brings a completely different energy, and that contrast is essential to the chemistry between the two leads. Where Ali feels emotionally open and vulnerable, Ivy feels sharper, freer, and more guarded at first. Temple plays her with confidence without making her feel emotionally cold. There's a playful edge to the performance, but underneath it is someone who understands survival very differently than Ali does. That contrast creates immediate tension between them, and because the two performances are so distinct, the friendship dynamic feels genuinely alive instead of mechanically written. You can hear the frustration between them early on. Looking ahead, the future of Skydance Animation now feels genuinely interesting because of this movie. If the studio keeps improving its storytelling while holding on to this level of visual artistry and emotional sincerity, it could become one of the more emotionally important animation studios of the next decade. But that growth depends on evolution, because SWAT also exposed the studio's weaknesses clearly: a predictable structure, over-explained themes, uneven pacing, occasionally shallow dialogue. The technical artistry is already there, and so is the emotional ambition. Now audiences want the narrative execution to match that ambition. Honestly, that's a good problem for a studio to have, since emotional emptiness is much harder to fix than structural inconsistency. At its best, SWAT feels like a real step forward for Skydance Animation, not because it's flawless, but because it proves the studio can build worlds audiences genuinely care about. That emotional connection is the hardest thing to manufacture in animation. Visuals impress people, emotion stays with them. And for the first time, a lot of audiences walked away from a Skydance film actually believing the studio might someday become something special in the industry, not just technically, but emotionally too. So after all the praise, the criticism, the emotional reactions, and the comparisons, where does SWAT ultimately land? Honestly, somewhere beautifully imperfect. That's probably the most accurate way to describe the film as a whole, because SWAT is not a flawless animated masterpiece, not revolutionary storytelling, not the most narratively sophisticated family film ever made. The screenplay absolutely has weaknesses, and the structure often follows familiar formulas. Certain emotional moments get over-explained, some supporting characters feel underdeveloped, and the pacing occasionally rushes through ideas that deserved more room. Depending on the viewer, parts of the film may land as emotionally powerful or emotionally simplistic. Those flaws are real. But what makes SWAT so fascinating is that despite all of them, it's still connected emotionally with an enormous number of people, and that connection is impossible to dismiss. Audiences weren't reacting like passive consumers, they were reacting emotionally. Families talked about crying together. Parents described their kids becoming fully invested. Viewers who expected nothing found themselves emotionally overwhelmed by the ending. People debated the themes, the twists, the characters, the sincerity, the optimism, the world building, the music, the atmosphere, and movies only generate that kind of reaction when something inside them genuinely reaches people. That's what separates SWAT from forgettable streaming animation. It leaves an emotional imprint. Whether that imprint feels profound or shallow depends entirely on the viewer. For emotionally driven audiences, SWAT was a refreshing throwback to older family storytelling traditions, a sincere, hopeful, warm, openly believing in empathy, kindness, coexistence, accountability, and forgiveness without hiding behind sarcasm or irony. For a lot of people, that sincerity felt genuinely refreshing, especially in a landscape where modern animation often feels emotionally guarded. So many family films seem afraid of real vulnerability, rushing to a joke the moment emotion appears, prioritizing franchise setup over emotional closure, leaning on cynicism because it feels safer than hope. SWAT does the opposite. It fully commits to emotional sincerity, and that commitment became both its greatest strength and, for some viewers, its greatest weakness. Audiences who didn't connect with that sincerity often saw the film very differently, where others saw emotional warmth. They saw predictable storytelling where others saw honesty. They saw over-explained themes where others saw optimism. They saw narrative simplicity hiding behind beautiful visuals. Both readings are valid, and that tension is part of what makes the movie so interesting. SWAT succeeds emotionally for a lot of viewers not because it perfectly executes every narrative element, but because it genuinely believes in what it's trying to say. The film believes understanding others matters, that emotional growth matters, that ecosystems, communities, and relationships survive through empathy rather than fear, and it never apologizes for those beliefs. Audiences could feel that sincerity. The visuals obviously play a huge role too. Almost everyone agreed the animation was stunning, the valley feels alive, the creature designs are imaginative, and the lighting, environmental detail, and color work create one of the most visually immersive worlds in recent streaming animation. Even critics of the screenplay admitted the technical artistry was exceptional, and that visual ambition elevates the whole experience. Because Swapped consistently feels crafted rather than manufactured. There's artistic care visible in the environments, the performances, the pacing, and the atmosphere. The movie may stumble structurally, but it rarely feels emotionally lazy. And that effort matters, especially in a streaming era full of disposable content. The emotional center of the film deserves a lot of credit too. Ali and Ivy carry the movie because their friendship feels sincere enough that audiences gradually grow attached to it almost without noticing, and by the time the emotional climax hits, viewers are reacting not just to plot resolution but to all the investment built up along the way. That emotional accumulation is one of the film's real achievements, and honestly, the ending says everything about the movie as a whole. Some viewers cried, some rolled their eyes, some found the payoff beautiful, others thought it manipulative or too convenient. But very few felt completely indifferent, and that matters, because indifference is the true death of storytelling. Swapped may divide audiences, but it undeniably engages them. The film also says something interesting about animation as an industry. It feels like a modern studio trying to rediscover emotional sincerity. Not perfectly, not consistently, but genuinely. It openly embraces warmth, optimism, and emotional vulnerability in ways a lot of modern animated films seem increasingly hesitant to do, and for many viewers, that alone made it memorable. There's certainly room to grow. A stronger dialogue, more subtle storytelling, deeper supporting characters, more confidence in visual storytelling over verbal explanation, more willingness to slow down during important emotional beats. Those are all places where Swapped clearly struggles at times. But strangely, those weaknesses almost make the film feel more human, because underneath the flaws, you can feel the ambition of artists trying to create something emotionally meaningful rather than simply producing content. And audiences respond to that effort, even when the execution isn't perfect.